I like to think of a colon as similar to a lens on a camera. And so even though we're going to review a number of uses of the colon in this video, the one feature that they all have in common is that they allow you to zoom into something specific that comes at the end of the sentence. So let's review the major uses of colons. We typically use colons in one of four ways. So let's review these. 1, 2, 3, and 4. In each case, we start with an independent clause, so a part of a sentence that has a subject and a verb and can stand by itself as a complete sentence. And then we follow up with the colon, and then we add something afterwards that zooms in. So in the first case, we'll add a list. 1, 2, 3. You could have more items, of course. In the second case, we'll start with our independent clause, add a colon, and conclude with an A positive. And we'll talk about what that actually means. In the third place, we'll start again with our independent clause, add a colon, and then we'll just have a quotation. And I think you're probably familiar with that. And then lastly, we're going to start with our independent clause, add a colon, and now we're actually going to add a complete independent clause. And that sounds a little bit like how you would use a semicolon. And we'll talk about the difference between the colon usage and the semicolon usage. So let's review each of these in some more detail now. Now the first usage that we talked about is before a list. And the thing to watch out for here is that you use the colon correctly. So we talked before about how you have to start with an independent clause, and you can check by reading just this bit by itself if your clause is indeed independent. So you could say there are 3 types of wine drinkers, and that could definitely be a complete sentence by itself. If you look at the second example here, the Vikings traveled as far as, if you just stopped your sentence there, you would know that's probably not an independent clause. And the reason for that is that there's no object on this side of the colon. The objects all follow after the colon. So what we want to do here is take this colon away. We don't want to have a colon because our introduction moves right into the list. We need these two to become one, and we can't have a colon interrupting the flow. So there's a very simple check you can do then. You can basically just read the opening bit by itself, and if it's a complete sentence, then it's an independent clause, and you can add the colon and then conclude with a list. Now I also said that you can use a colon before an A positive, and that takes a little bit of explanation. So an A positive is basically a noun phrase that renames an earlier noun phrase. If you say, for instance, Bob visits often, there's a sentence. You can rename Bob by basically introducing something in between. You could say, Bob, my uncle, visits often, and then you can add some commas around my uncle to set it off properly. So this little bit here, my uncle, is what's called an A positive. It's a noun phrase that renames an earlier noun. So in this case, my uncle renames Bob. You can also do this sort of thing at the end of a sentence. So you have your colon, and then you end with an A positive, and that A positive renames an earlier noun. So here we have, there's only one possible outcome, and we have a noun in outcome. And then death, the other noun, or it can also be a noun phrase, renames outcome. The second one is quite similar, even though it looks a little bit different. Collecting is a present participle, ends in ing, but we know that a present participle can act like a noun. In fact, it's called a gerund if it does that. Kind of a funny word, that one. So a gerund, and here it's renaming unusual hobby. So what is that unusual hobby? It's collecting naval fluff. Now, most of these cases then are basically one noun or a noun and some further description, but occasionally you can add a little bit more of an ending to your sentence. So in this case, it's not a complete sentence after the colon, but we have added a longer phrase just to conclude things and add a little bit more information. So our second usage then of the colon is the appositive. Most of the time just one single noun or a noun and some description. Sometimes we can add a little bit more of a final explanation. Our third use of the colon, as mentioned, is before a quotation. And again, we want to make sure that it comes after an independent clause, which it does in this case. And typically, if we use a colon to introduce a quote, we want the quotation itself also to be an independent clause. And you can read that by yourself if you like, just to check that it's a complete sentence and can stand by itself. There is one small exception. Occasionally you may also introduce a quotation with a colon if you follow it up with an appositive that forms the quote. So you can have an independent clause, a colon, and then the quotation is an appositive. That's much more rare, but it is something to watch out for. And so we get to our last major use of the colon, which is between two independent clauses. So in the first example here, you traveled all this way for nothing, the car has already been sold. The second clause, starting with the car, basically zooms in and explains the first. So why was it pointless to travel this way? Well, the car has been sold. In the second example, we used a semicolon here. We could also use a comma because the clauses are quite short. But we've used a semicolon because these two clauses are equal. And that's really the difference between the two. If the second clause is more specific, you're allowed to use a colon. If the two clauses are of equal standing, as in this case, these two clauses are basically contrasts, then you would use a semicolon. Now there's one more thing to know here. If you use a colon and you zoom in the second clause, you have a choice. So you can either capitalize the first word of the second clause, or you can leave it not capitalized. And it's really up to you what you do. There are different guidelines depending on what standards you use. So if you work for a newspaper or a publishing firm, but in general, it's up to you what you prefer. And the main thing is just to be consistent in your approach. And that's it for major uses of the colon. We'll finish now with just some minor uses you may come across. So if you are citing Bible texts, it's quite common to use a colon between the chapter and the verse. We can also use it in giving the time of the day, and it's quite common in titles. So we can separate the two elements of our title with a colon. That's it for colons. Hope you enjoyed watching this movie.